What is the dialectic? Um, so, the concept of a dialectic has existed throughout the course of Western philosophy. Socrates had a dialectic. I think Heraclitus talked about a dialectic. Um, Neither of these two used it in the sense that, like, Hegel or Marx used it in. To them, they understood it simply as like a dialogue or a discourse. Um, but then it came back into vogue with Kant actually discusses the dialectic. He uses it in their sense, in the sense of the ancient Greeks. Hegel, of course, is the one who revolutionized our understanding of this concept. For Hegel, the dialectic is an entire movement that occurs within the world, and for him, it's within the within the mind of God. The world is God's idea, and he describes this very elaborate system of movement, of the process of self-realization of the idea driven by its own internal contradictions. The phenomenology of spirit, in which he first elaborates this idea, is actually quite a beautiful book. It's almost written like a novel. Um, the science of logic is a little bit different. He attempts to systematize it more there. At no point, by the way, does he ever use the synthesis antithesis or the thesis antithesis synthesis triad that comes from Fichte. For Hegel, the dialectic is an organic, naturally occurring thing, and you can see it in the whole movement of world history. Um, Unfortunately, under the young Hegelians, it became a rigid thing that there must be a synthesis, there must be an antithesis. But this isn't really what Hegel is talking about. He's talking about the movement from the proposition to its negation internally. It's a different thing, and it's very difficult to describe. I don't think I have the words for it quite yet. Um, but Hegel was a brilliant man. Um, and Marx, of course, takes this up and he does invert it and he applies the dialectic to the material world and to processes within the material world. But even there, it's not nearly as rigid as most Marxists make it out to be. In Capital, Marx says that he coquettes with Hegel, but he doesn't rely on any kind of triadic structure in that book. The closest that Marx ever becomes to being a Hegelian is, of course, in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And in that book, he merely examines Hegel's own logic, and he applies the dialectic to the internal contradictions within Hegel's own philosophy of the state to arrive at a radically different conclusion. Uh, but it's brilliant stuff. So fundamentally, what is the dialectic? It's a process of internal development according to the precepts of a existing structure, and everything is governed by this dialectic, from the movement of the smallest molecule to the thoughts in your head. Um, but it manifests itself differently. Like you can't really speak of a atom having a negation. You may be able to speak in the most vulgar terms of matter having an antithesis in the form of antimatter, but that's a sort of spiritual abstraction that we try to stay away from. Um, but it is basically impossible to be a Marxist without being a dialectician. And now I know that there are various schools of thought that try to get away from this, but it doesn't work. Marx is explicitly, he accepts the validity of the dialectic. I think Trotsky someplace, and I haven't read as much Trotsky as I might have liked, but I think he compares it to a sugar. How many grains of sugar does it take to make up a sugar cube? This is not, it's dialectical, but it's a very, again, a formulaic understanding of what I think we would want to avoid. Um, the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's primary work on the subject of the dialectic, it contains within the title phenomenology. And a phenomenology is an attempt to examine from an internal first person perspective what what an experience is like. There's a phenomenology of everything. Everything has that experience, and the phenomenology of logic is an attempt to grasp logic from its own inner perspective. And if this isn't understood, then nothing else will be. But again, Trotsky, with his sugar cube metaphor, takes that and he vulgarizes it. It's not like that. You have to understand capital by its own internal perspective, or you'll never grasp what Marx is trying to do. He's also creating a phenomenology of capital within capital. Um, I almost wish that he would have titled that work, the phenomenology of capital or something like that, but it's too late. Um, it's very interesting stuff. I would highly recommend, just read Hegel. Like, it's daunting, but it's not if you take the time to read it. It's not that bad. I promise you, I'm a high school dropout, and I read it in about 3 days. It's not that bad.